for webinar number 4 in the 6th webinar series with Sue Trautman. Sue has had a passion for Ayres sensory integration throughout her career and has been highly invested in teaching others throughout the world about this valuable theory, assessment process, and intervention. She's closely involved with the Ayres Sensory Integration 2020 vision, assisting with development of the EASY test materials, coordination of field and pilot testing for the EASY, and Sue is also an instructor with Classy. Sue founded and worked until 2018 at the Center for Developing Kids in Pasadena, California. And we are so excited to have Sue with us here today to share some of her expertise and knowledge. So thank you so much, Sue. We're very lucky to have you with us and preparing such valuable lessons for everyone.
Thank you, Katie. All right, just let me know if you can't hear me because I sound a little bit like I'm in a vacuum to myself. So, okay, so first of all, welcome to everybody, and I wanted to just make a note that for some reason on this title slide, a couple of words are missing. Sometimes things in this format switch out a little bit, and it should say, I need confidence, what do I say to the parent or teacher? And let's see, I gotta get my little arrow. As Katie mentioned, this is the 4th webinar in the series, and what I will be talking about is based on my personal experience as a clinician, primarily in the private practice that I used to own, and also as an administrator of that private practice and as an instructor in the areas of sensory integration. These webinars are intended to support those taking the Class C modules, and so some of the slides you will have seen in your module lessons, but most of the slides in this particular webinar are going to demonstrate an idea of mine being related to the topic being presented. So I'm going to really be talking about communication, and also we'll get into a little bit of, actually quite a bit of report writing. So really the goal is, when we're trying to talk to parents or teachers, is to have excellent communication. And communication would be using the correct words to express the idea. And I think that all of us as therapists really want to be outstanding or extremely good. And I don't know about you, but often I've felt like I just can't get the right words out. And so this webinar is to try and help with that. If you do end up typing questions in the chat box, sometimes I get going on this webinar, I get a little bit passionate, and I might not notice it until the end, but I certainly will try and address your questions at the end. I will probably talk for about a half an hour, maybe a little bit more as we get into the details, and then we should be able to chat. So I look forward to that. All right. So one of the first steps is the elevator test. And what this means is, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, is that the elevator test is about being able to communicate those correct words to express your ideas, essentially in the time it takes to ride an elevator. So imagine, just to give you the concept, I would like you to imagine that you want to set up a sensory motor room at your school, your hospital, or just in your community, and you feel that it's going to be very hard to convince the administration to allow this. So you spend a lot of time preparing a PowerPoint, you gather a lot of evidence-based research materials, because you also know that it is very difficult to get a meeting set up with this person that you know is the key to you getting your wishes met. So you finally get the meeting, you're sitting down with that person, and all of a sudden the administrator gets, or the person you're meeting with gets a phone call and has to attend to a crisis at a nearby school or hospital. And you are devastated because you've worked so hard. But the administrator says, don't worry, or she just says how sorry she is, and she asks you to walk her down to her car or outside of the building and to summarize your ideas. So you literally have the time it takes to ride down the elevator and to pitch your idea. So you have to be really succinct because you really want this badly. So if you can do it successfully, if you actually end up getting what you wanted, you probably communicated using the correct words in an outstanding manner. However, most of us need to know how to pass the SI, sensory integration, elevator test, or the OT or the PT or whatever our profession is, because you will need this ability to succinctly explain your profession or sensory integration for the rest of your career. And you are going to need to do this to the general public, and it will get you through that initial contact with the teachers and parents that you work with. Now, when I've had extra time in some of the courses that I've taught, I've asked the class participants to come up with some basic examples, and I'm going to share a couple of those with you. One person said, we use carefully designed sensory motor play activities to teach children how to interact successfully with their environment and how to use that information and make sense of it to perform daily activities that we take for granted, that they may find very hard, like riding a bike, going to the park, going to a ball game, brushing teeth, walking across the street, or paying attention in school. And you could always, of course, you could design this your own way. I'm just trying to give you an idea of some elevator speeches, so to speak. This participant, this one we actually worked on as a class, and the participant said she usually uses riding a bike. So she says, remember when you learned to ride a bike? This skill uses most of your senses: vision to see where you're going, hearing to listen for danger, touch for the handlebars and the pedals. You need proprioception, which lets your muscles and joints know how hard to press on the pedals. You need balance, which depends on your vestibular sense that detects movement and gravity. If any one of these senses are not working well, you may not be able to ride a bike. Occupational therapists find out which sensory systems are working well and which are in need of improvement or improved perception, so the child can ride a bike or do other activities that are limiting participation. So it's my thought that getting your profession elevator speech down and your SI elevator speech down is going to be critical for you throughout your future. But we have to go further than that, because we want to be able to communicate with excellence and activity analysis and link that to the assessment. So in my situation, I would do an assessment, and then I would have the child participate in some clinic-based activities. And at some point, if the parent wasn't watching the entire process, which I usually had them do, they would come in and watch me do a few of these activities. Now, this is a little bit, obviously, more like a treatment activity, and you can look at it and see that there's, vestibular, proprioceptive, there's bilateral hand skills, engagement, etc. But that is not quite enough, because what has happened to me, or is that a parent would say, well, why are you doing that? I don't understand what this has to do about all those concerns I put on the sensory processing measure. Or what does that have to do with, what are you looking for? I saw that she was having so much trouble during some of the testing. So you need to, this is an example of what I might have said here. I might have said, well, I chose this activity since when you are in this lying down position with your head lifted a bit and moving rapidly through space, this strengthens the system that helps a child sit upright and pay attention. And I don't know if you noticed, but during the testing, she kept leaning on the desk and putting her head down. And so this kind of an activity came to mind to get a lot of movement and get her in this position to help that system. She also tended to kind of tilt and fall out of her chair and kind of slump. And so I'm working on also her muscles and joints, and just trying to to strengthen her movement and her muscle joint systems through this activity. I might go a little bit further and draw attention to maybe an item I saw that they put on the SPM, but I then might say something like, this activity has such an intensity when I really move the swing in big directions back and forth that it almost demands that her movement system pay attention to what she's perceiving, and by doing multiple things at once or integrating with other sensations, she becomes more successful. So her body learns through these activities to manage a lot in order to participate successfully. Okay. And then just to help you with your elevator speeches, there is an organization called Pathways, and if you check on pathways.org, there are a lot of very short videos. This is just a small sample, but you can notice that there are some that are also in Spanish, and there may be some other languages, but these kind of videos I've used in presentations, and they've been very helpful to me as well. So what I'm really talking about is kind of goes across many areas of DDDM, and if you follow DDDM, which is a data-driven decision-making process, this will help you use the correct words to express your ideas, because you really have to think through everything when you put things down on paper. And what I'm trying to help you prevent is imposter syndrome. And I mention this because I don't know how many therapists I've had or worked with who've said, I just feel like I'm so nervous to talk to the parents or teacher because I'm afraid they're going to ask me a question that I don't know, and here I'm only out of school for a couple of years, or I might even be out for a number of years, but I'm not good at thinking on my feet, and sometimes I feel like an imposter. So one of the steps is the SI elevator speech or OT elevator speech, and another is the activity analysis, and then another is report writing. So when I write a report possibly different than many other people, and I'm going to share that with you. And one of the things that I try and do is decrease my use of jargon. So if I use the word vestibular, I might put in parentheses a very, very brief definition, or I might use the definition and then put in parentheses vestibular system. I try not to do any repetition, and I will tell you why. My reports were so long initially, and I had a doctor say to me, Sue, just highlight maybe six sentences in the whole report, 6 to 10 sentences, because I don't read your reports, and none of the other doctors in my office do either. And I was in quite a medical kind of setting at the time, and I was like, that really took me aback. He said, I want to know what the problem is, what did you find out, what's going to be done, and who's going to do it. And he said, just answer those questions as simple as possible, and that really got me thinking. The other thing that's just a standard in my reports is that at the very end, I go back and I make sure that I've added as many strengths as I possibly can. And, we're really good as therapists, I think all of us, at finding a problem and really trying to dissect it and understand it. But we also, of course, know that we need to use strengths to help us with addressing the problem. But the other reason is that as a parent, anytime you hear anything at all that is not exceptionally that is not good, anything that's even the remotely smallest problem that your child might have, it really is painful and it really hurts. So I try and think about that and go back and double check anywhere I can really add strengths. All right, so now we're going to get into actual format. Okay, the first thing I want to point out is the reason for referral. And this section is important to be very specific because you are going to depend on this section for your impression. And so you can use quotes from the family or the referring source, such as, won't eat textured food, bumps into others. I might take something. I usually don't take something from the SPM. I try and get some information from the referring source. But I don't want something that just says fine motor skills are a problem. Because I know that fine motor skills involve a lot of different things, and I want to figure out, I want to be able to address that, figure out what is going on and address that. Then there's the occupational profile, and I list the assessments. And then the evaluation of occupational performance is something that I do a little bit differently than some people, and I list only facts and data. I don't really have any discussions or conclusions, and this method of mine is just my method. It works for me. It doesn't mean that other methods are not okay. A lot of people feel really comfortable doing different things, but I feel comfortable just listing the facts first and getting to a discussion or impression later. Okay. Then I will usually put in the SIP bar graph, and I often provide a general description of the SIP, but when I was looking at the descriptions that are available to add into this webinar, there was a lot of different ones, and I couldn't quite decide on the one that would be the best for your setting or the best. So that I would just encourage you, if you want to put in a definition, to look at some other report examples that have them and see if they sit right with you and that they truly represent the SIP. But the thing that you might notice at the bottom is that I do describe the graphed results in the next section. I'll show you. And I really rely pretty heavily on this article that's listed here because it's really great for school systems, but it also can be adapted to just about any setting. Here's an example, and I want to make sure that you know that how I group and whether I even put in average, below average, etc., is really based each time on the recipient, the referring problem, the assessment. It could be very different. So, for example, here, if you look at figure ground perception, which is the second test down, you notice in parentheses it says helps the student find an item in their pencil box or on a shelf or spot a friend on a crowded playground. Some of those definitions have been taken from this article. Some of them, throughout here might have changed a little bit. And if a child was referred to me from a classroom and the teacher was saying they can never find their materials, I might, change this definition just a little bit so that I can validate the teacher's perception and I can make it meaningful to them. So you can see here these particular headings were actually required by the school district. And then I added in praxis, and then there was some on postural and motor control, and that was, further on, but I just wanted you to get the idea, and I wanted to encourage you to take a look at that article if you're struggling with this. I once had a therapist from a school district that I was doing an assessment at tell me that I shouldn't use the SIP because it wasn't pertinent, and I said, oh, yes it is, and this was really helpful when I was able to explain why it was pertinent. And it helped the teachers, too. They really liked it. Okay, and then I need to talk about this section as well, because sometimes I will just do really brief bullet points on what I saw. And again, I don't have any discussion. I'm not going on and on. What did I see related to engagement, attention, regulation? What did I see in these various areas? The one area that I might have a little more discussion, and I might put just a little bit of my personal impressions in, would be the sensory area. And this one, I can see that I probably didn't get a lot of information about sensory when I was just doing the observations. And this is also an area where some therapists prefer to do 2 or 3 pages worth of information related to each sensory system, but again, my goal is to shorten and really just report facts. Okay, so the reason we have to look at, based on the assessment, why the referring problems are occurring must be answered in the impression or discussion section, and they must relate directly to the suggested goals. This is important because what I've seen before is, as therapists, as I mentioned, we're really good at looking into all the problems, and we find these problems, and we write our impression, and we may never address the reason why the person brought the child to us in the first place, the parent or the teacher, whoever referred, because we get so wrapped up in all these other things that we found. But really, what's the important thing is answering their questions and then also making goals related to their concerns. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here's Scott. He's been referred for touching others, difficulty following the routine, sustaining peer relationships. And the SPM, before I even did the SIP, because I usually get that ahead of time, showed a number of items as frequently or always occurring, particularly in the areas of touch and balance and motion, and there were also problems in social participation. So I wasn't sure, but I expected that perhaps the SIP would show low scores. I didn't know, but in fact, the scores were average. I talked about this scenario a little bit in another webinar, and I'm not going to give you all the information from this assessment, but let's look at what I wrote. And this first one's a bit long, but I think it's important to see my thought process, I guess. I don't know if it's important, but I wanted to share it. So the sample impression is I always start out with a summary statement, such as the SIPT, SPM, and school and clinical observation results indicate that Scott has difficulty managing or modulating sensation, particularly movement and touch. This manifests itself in one way in Scott's activity level, seen in the morning at school as he runs on the playground, which sometimes assists him, and I'm underlining the words that are leading to my hypothesis. You'll see that they're underlined throughout, but it sometimes assists him in getting ready, but sometimes it increases his activity level even more. This type of fluctuation is also seen in his need for touching others. He seems to need more information, but then he doesn't want to be messy, seeming sensitive to touch, and then he's not always fully aware of food on his face, and he doesn't seem sensitive to touch. So there's a lot of variability here. And then the SIP gave me great information that noted typical touch perception. And these responses suggest it's the managing or modulating and being comfortable with touch sensation that's interfering with his function and participation. And then sometimes I throw in an example as an adult, and I put this in here simply because we discussed this particular example in one of the last webinars. And then if you go down to the last paragraph, I again say this fluctuating response to sensation interferes with Scott's successful participation in peer relationships and following the typical routine at school. And then the discrepancy between home and school, because that was another part of the results, is likely at least partly explained by the more predictable, controlled, and quieter atmosphere Scott encounters at home as he's the only child. I find it a positive thing to look at the differences between the home and school SPM if I can get it. And then I just mentioned some of his strengths. Okay? So that is that one, and then let's look at one more example. This is John, and he has referring problems with it. He has difficulty sitting still, he falls out of his chair, pushes others, uses excessive force when writing, and the SPM had noted similar problems. Always are frequently occurring related to leaning on surfaces, breaking objects, tiring easily. He's stomping his feet. And then the SIPT noted that there were average visual and touch perception and praxis scores and low PRN and kinesthesia. And the clinical observations centered a lot around vestibular proprioceptive concerns. And again, what I said was, and these are straight from some of my old reports, so they're a little bit, they are what they are. But the results of the SIPT, SPM, and clinical observations indicate that John has strengths in perception of visual and touch information, and that his sensory systems responding to movement and muscle joint sensation require increased input primarily to sustain postural stability. This essentially is my hypothesis. This is somewhat like my elevator speech, I guess. The result is that John has a need to lean or push against surfaces for support or muscle joint sensation, and to use an inordinate amount of pressure for managing materials, resulting in fatigue, breaking objects, use of daily activities, as well as finding it difficult to sit still at times. And since John has good motor planning and visual perception per the SIPT and SPM, his difficulty with handwriting at school is most likely related to sustaining the postural stability through the shoulder and trunk to produce written work. His impulsive behavior of using excessive force may have a relationship to seeking out strong muscle joint input, and then I put in proprioception. Now, sometimes what I will do also is I will contact the parent and say, this is what I'm thinking, and I will sometimes contact them before I complete the report, or I will send out a draft of the report and say, what do you think? Am I getting to your concerns? Am I on the right track? And of course, I will never change some of my personal opinion or professional opinion, but I want to know that I'm really doing a service for the family or the teacher. And usually they give me a little bit more information, or usually they are okay with it. But the reason I do this, and this takes courage, by the way, it takes a lot of courage. First of all, it takes a lot of work to write the report, and it takes courage to ask some of these questions. And I'm not saying I do it every time, but it's very helpful in knowing whether making sure that you're not just repeating back information that was given to you. I once had a parent who was referred to me by a doctor who I was really liked her a lot, and the parent never called me back after we met about the report, and I finally had the courage to ask the doctor, whatever happened to that family? And the doctor told me, she said that you just repeated the facts that she gave you back. You didn't answer her question. So that's why I'm really serious about this piece of putting the referring problem right back into the impression. Trying to share the errors that I've made over the years and the successes that I've had as well. Okay, now this is something I don't always do, but I've started doing it more recently, not only putting in recommendations, but kind of a general treatment plan. You're probably reading through these right now, and I'm not going to read through them with you, but I'll let you just glance for a second, and then I want to talk about it. So, number one, you can see that I'm recommending that there's a goal review at 3 months or sooner. Again, this takes a little bit of courage to stay in good contact with the family and say, do you understand what I'm doing? Because on the face of it, sensory integration it's not really obvious unless we talk about this pretty regularly. I also put under number 7, I put some tips or some information about collaborating, and sometimes I put books, sometimes I put websites. And then I also, some of the other numbers 2 through 6 are just related collaboration and some ideas. We often write our impression, we write our goals, and we don't talk about our treatment. And if you're not going to put things in your report, make sure you have the courage to discuss them with your families. So I tend to write my goals near the end. I know in school districts you develop the goals first and then you determine what the service is. But with DDDM, or the data-driven decision-making, when we're talking about proximal goals, we're talking about things that are related to factors affecting participation that are more commonly used with terminology that therapists are used to, like praxis, processing and integrating sensation. But these kind of words do set the stage for family education and giving them, just some ideas about what you're doing. And then distal goals are really meaningful to the family because they're directly related to the referring problem. So my distal goals are almost always the flip side of what the family said when they referred, like the child's always falling out of their chair. Then my goal would be related to something about the child not falling out of their chair. And here is an example of a goal. This is from one of your lessons. I think it's M4 or 5, and you always want to look at the presenting participation challenge, and then we look at that underlying problem as identified through our assessment and hypothesis, and then the desired functional outcome. And this is the important part for no matter what setting that you are in, is talking about that underlying problem. And I put a little bit of that, maybe not quite this lengthy, in all of my goals. I put a lead in related to some of the proximal information so that I can educate and show the difference between myself as an occupational therapist and another member of the team, and link that participation challenge to the outcome. Here's that same information in a goal. This is again from your lessons. So you would take this, and you of course would have to adapt it to your setting, because this may not be properly measurable for your setting, or you might have to do some different things. But the idea is to have this kind of a goal that has just a little bit more information. And I just want to go back in my mind just for a minute to when I'm writing that impression and kind of thinking about the goals and the referring problem. When I go to a meeting, to an IEP or to a family meeting, I usually take my report and I look at that impression section. And again, remember, I've written no conclusions anywhere else throughout the report. Just at the very end, I write it in the impression. And I try and make sure that that section is understandable so that I could say it out loud in a meeting in a handful of sentences and have everyone understand what I'm saying. I've done a lot of second opinions, and so I've found it really important to have my reports really clean and tight so that if I get asked a question, I just always can refer back to my report and use statements from that report. So that is one of the reasons why I've used this method, because when I get too involved with all my thought processes going into the report, I get confused. There are times when I don't use this method that I've shown you at all for one reason or another, based on the family or the teacher or the way my thoughts are going that day, but I'm just sharing this real straightforward method for you in case it's helpful. So using the correct words to express your ideas, and being really good with your, being outstanding or extremely good with your use of words. It is really difficult, but it does go across all of these areas, and it does, as I mentioned, take a little bit of courage to ask the questions if you're helping, and if not, how can I help? And then the families usually respect you tremendously, and if you can do this, you're going to be an excellent communicator, and you are going to be able to avoid imposter syndrome. And just one final comment here on this imposter syndrome. None of us like that feeling. And one of the therapists that I worked with, who was relatively new, I think she'd been out of school for about 2 or 3 years, and she was really bright and she did really great work, and she was really nervous if a family would ask her a question that she didn't know the answer to, or would bring up a new technique. Well, have you heard about this, or have you heard about that? And she said she finally realized that what was more important to them was that she listened, that she loved their child, and that she, of course, did have basic knowledge and good knowledge in her profession, but what was most important was that she really cared and loved for their child. So I think that therapists, that's kind of where our heart is anyway with the children, and if a family can feel that, then you're going to have a relationship of trust, and you can work together to help that child, and you can just say to the family, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll find it out. Okay? Okay, and that is pretty much it. So now we are open to questions. I see that we have someone who's looking for virtual reality-based social skills training with autism. I don't know the answer to that. If anybody does, feel free to type it in, virtual reality-based social skills training with autism for children. I don't know the answer to that. I did social skill groups for many, many years, but I don't have that information. Okay, some people are typing. Wait and see. I'm not sure what Jason liked something, but it must have been something that we were talking about, which is good. Oh, yes, the article. Tina's asking about the article, and I can try and go back to that slide, but it is also, it's in OT practice. Let's see, where am I? I'm trying to go back to the slide here for just a minute. I think it was pretty early on. Let me see. Oops. Oh, sorry. Sorry about this. Just hang on. I'm getting a little bit mixed up in my slides. There we go. All right, so there is the article. It's an OT practice. That article also has a wonderful table that we use into in some of our modules, but it shows a handwriting chart. It shows a list of all of the different things that could go into handwriting, and I've used that as well for families, and that's been really helpful when they might say, I don't really need an assessment, I just want to refer this child for handwriting. I just want you to work on handwriting with them, and I say, well, it could be visual perception, it could be touch, it could be motor planning, it could be, and on and on. And this particular article has that information in here, in there. Okay, let's see. Ann B, can you speak to differentiating the family? Oh, to differentiating to the family the difference in using the SIPT versus other sensory questionnaires. Okay, most schools that I have worked with cannot afford SIP testing, and therefore the OTs rely solely on the SPM. Okay, excellent question, or sensory profile. And I use the sensory profile as well. Okay, so we're talking about two different things completely between the SPM and the sensory profile in any questionnaires. And they are wonderful because they give people's perception. But if I truly want to know whether a child's or people's perception is it gives the view, I guess I should say, of the family or the teacher. The SIP, of course, we know actually compares the child against many, many other children who were tested, as the EASY will be doing in even greater numbers. So, as I mentioned in another webinar, if a child's having trouble perhaps with touch, and actually even in this webinar, you could see that the boy who was having problems with touch, it wasn't really his perception, it was something else. So we need to learn to treat the exact problem. I don't think I'm being very clear on that, but in any event, I want to talk to the cannot afford SIP testing. That really should not be the case, because I guess if the school can't afford the test kit, that's something that might be a little bit different, but I'm sure that you have, most schools do allow other kits, test kits, and the therapist doesn't have to do every single SIP, every test that's in the SIP. And the next webinar, I'm going to be talking about that very specifically as to how to get a comprehensive assessment with little time, with little money, and with maybe a lack of materials. So it's been my impression that it's a mindset, just like I said when I told the therapist who told me the SIP isn't a good use in the school, and I was able to show her that article that showed how these tests were related directly to school performance. I do hear what you're saying, because I've heard this and I've felt that in school districts, but in school districts, usually I don't know, Ann, did you have to pay specifically for the SIP test? And perhaps you are in a private school, or because the school districts that I've worked in, the parents weren't charged for anything. For outside clinicians, they don't have to. You don't have to go to outside clinicians to perform, because you can do it. You can do the SIP. If you learn it, you can do it, and it's great. It's a great help in school districts. And again, luckily we have the EASY coming. We're going to have a lot more options. Let's see. Deb says, I want to go back to Debbie's thing up here for a minute. Right. Okay, Debbie's talking about the time, and so I'm really excited for the next webinar, because I really need to wait until the next webinar, so I hope you can attend or listen to it. It's in about a month from now, because I'm going to talk to you about how I reduce my time in getting these tests and how I've done it. And sometimes I have to do it over a couple of different sessions, and sometimes I get permission from the parents or the administrator to do it over a number of sessions, because many therapists in the schools, I think, see kids only for maybe a half an hour. But I've got ideas for you. And one of them is that you don't have to give every single one of the 17 tests. And you may be giving some other tests anyway. You may be not using the SIP. But the SIP to me is no different, and actually preferable at times, than some of the other tests. But that's, of course, my opinion. Well, it's more than it is my opinion, but it's been my experience. I should say it's my experience. I feel really confident about that I've had really great results using various SIP tests. I'll show you next time. Without certification. So are you saying, okay, so in the past, and you have had to go through the larger process of going through the courses and getting your certificate and giving the test. And that was a really good process, a good way to do it, and you would come out and you'd have this thing called a certificate. The reality of the SIPT is that when Dr. Ayres developed it, she developed it as individual tests, and if you were trained in these individual tests and had the manual and you were properly trained by someone who really knew what they were doing, you could give a couple of those tests. Maybe not all of them, might be too difficult to do, but for example, there was a time when I did train some of the staff that worked at my company on some of the tactile tests, because we would rather have these tests being given than them nobody addressing the tactile system at all, and that seemed to be the real problem. And then we can get true results to compare the child with their age group, and it just is more valid and standardized results. So the best thing to do is to go through a process to learn these tests. But if you can't do it, and the other idea, of course, is just to learn the test, and there's a lot of classes right now that are coming up throughout the U.S. and actually all over the world where you can learn these. So you can look into that, and you can maybe find some information on the Classy website or from other organizations. Debbie says it can save the school money in the long run if you are able to really pinpoint why there are foundational issues. That's correct, Debbie, and that's just, again, if you got to get those elevator speeches down, those SI speeches down, those OT, so people really understand what you're doing. Trying to think of an example. And another example is if in fact you were able to pinpoint the real foundational issue, work on it, and then re-administer the SIPT and show the progress, just like you could with other tests perhaps, then you might be more convincing to your administrator. So just like I was saying in the very beginning about the speech related to a sensory motor room, you can get your elevator speech down for getting a new test kit or for getting training in this area. It's really helped me. That's all I can tell you, that it's really, really helped me to have this in my back pocket. Okay, Sandra, how to tell the parent there is not a complete sensory integration? They are always aware when the kid is going to... I think... I'm not really sure I understand your question, Sandra, but are you trying to ask if what we're doing is going to make everything perfectly 100% better? I'm not sure if that's what you're asking. I would refer the family to those pathways videos. I'd refer them to Sensory Integration and the Child, the 25th anniversary edition. I would learn as much as I can, again, to get my communication in an expert manner that I could sit down with the family, but I think that's what you're asking. I'm not really sure. Okay, anything else? Sandra, if you're still there, you can let me know if that's what you meant. Okay. All right. Any other questions? I see some familiar names here on the list, and I see some new names. And we had, last time we had many countries involved. And if there aren't any more questions, I would be curious if we have anyone from out of the United States. Or if you have more questions. Oh, Argentina, Canada, all right. Well, and we're so, South Africa, oh, love these places. I'm so grateful to all of you coming on, because I know it's sometimes very strange times, or not strange, very difficult times. Some people have to get up or stay up late, and so we're really appreciative. And in addition, as I've said before, I just think it's such a wonderful opportunity that we can share, because everybody in this room has a lot of expert advice. So it's really fun to be able to be together and share our information. Okay, Anne is typing. You are so welcome, Anne. I hope I answered everyone's questions. I hope this is helpful. And, oh, also, I saw the very first question was related to future webinars. I'm going to ask this next time as well. We have 2 more webinars. One is related to time, money, funding, comprehensive assessment, and the last one's related to actual clinic environment or sensory space. So other than that, if anybody has anything they would really like to hear about in future webinars, we can look at that as an organization and see if we can address it, particularly related to to our classy modules. Oh, yes, I'm glad we are all learning, and I'm telling you, I'm still learning all the time, and it's a lot of work, but it's so well worth it. Are you waiting for Anne? Oh, sure. I will. Anne says, could you consider a webinar regarding pairing your knowledge with the behavior therapists in the schools? I worked with a lot of behavior therapists at the schools, and I've had some collaborative opportunities, and in our area. But I know when I've taught around the world and around the country that this differs pretty widely, and so I will see. I will pass that on. I don't know how much I have to offer in that area, except for that it's been helpful to just share our knowledge, and then usually to work as closely with them as you can, and I know that's sometimes difficult, but yeah, okay. Anything else? We have just a couple more minutes. Lots of sensory devices being recommended with the behavior therapist. Okay, so Anne, the comment that I have, and if anybody else has any other comments, please put them in here, is that the closer you can get to the behavior therapists and the more information you can share with them, the better it is. I've found that getting territorial is not really helpful, but sharing what I know and really being interested in what they're learning, and maybe talking with some of the supervisors and doing some in-services, that's been helpful in our area. And I've actually done some presentations with behavior therapists. But I've had my challenges as well, but no, that's a very good topic. Okay. Well, I think that's it, and thank you again, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you another time. I appreciate your participation, and have a good night, everybody, or good morning, or whatever time it is there for you. All right. Katie, do you have anything to add?